For decades, sports science has operated on a strict binary. If you exercise at a low intensity, you burn fat. But as you push harder, your muscles demand a faster burning fuel, forcing a shift exclusively to carbohydrates. This chart illustrates the crossover concept, the foundational model taught in kinesiology textbooks worldwide. The model plots exercise intensity against fuel source, showing that as a human approaches 85% of their maximum output, lipid oxidation plummets to near zero. Because of this model, elite endurance athletes, like Tour de France cyclists maintaining threshold outputs for hours, are instructed to consume up to 1 kilogram of carbohydrates daily. Sports dietitians treat these regular infusions of gels and sports drinks as non-negotiable. The prevailing logic is that muscles operating near their limit require this constant supply of exogenous sugar to function as jet fuel. Recent clinical data presents a severe anomaly in this model. Professor Tim Noakes conducted randomized crossover trials analyzing athletes who were fully adopted to a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. When placed under extreme physiological load, athletes restricted to under 50 grams of daily carbohydrates did not hit a wall. Instead, at 86% of their maximum output, they demonstrated the highest rates of fat oxidation ever recorded in humans. The heavy reliance on carbohydrates at peak intensities is a forced consequence of prior dietary conditioning rather than a universal biological imperative. If carbohydrates are not mandatory for high-intensity output, we have to ask why a standard athlete's metabolism defaults so aggressively to burning sugar. Human metabolism evolved over 3 million years alongside the consumption of animal protein and fat. Our baseline physiological architecture is designed to metabolize endogenous and exogenous lipid stores. The modern dietary landscape forces a completely different mechanism. The vast majority of our current caloric intake is derived from heavily processed cereals and grains. When a contemporary athlete ingests hundreds of grams of carbohydrates, their body rapidly oxidizes that sugar, but it does not do so because sugar is an inherently superior fuel. The immediate oxidation of carbohydrates during both rest and exercise is a metabolic disposal mechanism. The body is attempting to clear an overwhelming systemic load. To understand this disposal process, we have to look at the two-pool model of human glucose management. This diagram represents the primary glucose pool. The circulatory system holds 5 liters of blood, containing exactly 5 grams of circulating glucose. That's a single teaspoon of sugar, rigidly enforced to maintain neurological homeostasis and basic survival. A typical meal or sports drink delivers a massive bolus of carbohydrates directly into the digestive tract. As that sugar is absorbed, it instantly overwhelms the strict 5-gram capacity, creating an immediate systemic crisis. The pancreas responds to this systemic overwhelm by triggering a massive secretion of insulin. We often frame insulin as a transport mechanism delivering energy to ourselves. But under an acute carbohydrate load, its primary function is emergency clearance. Insulin forcefully shunts excess glucose into the secondary pool, the limited storage within the liver and muscles. If an individual has not engaged in heavy exertion, those secondary liver and muscle pools are already at maximum capacity. The incoming glucose has nowhere to go. Chronic overflowing of the 5-gram limit forces the liver to convert the excess circulating glucose into visceral adipose tissue. This process lays the architectural foundation for systemic insulin resistance. The systemic disposal of glucose creates a severe secondary effect at the cellular level. This animated model shows a cross-section of a skeletal muscle fiber. When insulin binds to a surface receptor, it dictates exactly how that tissue generates power. It creates a rigid lipid oxidation blockade. Free fatty acids are physically inhibited from crossing into the mitochondria. You do not need a massive spike to trigger this shutdown. A fractional drop of circulating insulin above baseline is sufficient to completely halt fat burning. This mechanism explains a paradox observed in clinical settings when measuring the metabolism of carbohydrate-adapted athletes sitting completely at rest. Even while completely inactive, these subjects exhibit highly elevated rates of carbohydrate oxidation. Their bodies are not metabolizing sugar to prepare for explosive athletic power. They are aggressively burning off the excess glucose load to protect the primary 5-gram blood pool. Elevated insulin locks the body out of its own fat stores, forcing it to burn carbohydrates purely as a disposal mechanism. This fuel selection dynamic is governed by a principle known as skeletal muscle autoregulation. Autoregulation means that the specific volume of glycogen stored inside a muscle fiber prior to exertion determines exactly what fuel that muscle will select. Look at the left side of this model. A muscle fiber fully packed with glycogen is inextricably linked with elevated basal insulin. Fat molecules are locked out of the mitochondria. When exertion begins, blood delivers fat, but the muscle cannot access it, forcing it to burn internal carbohydrates. Now look at the right side. Researchers tested athletes in a deeply carbohydrate-depleted state, keeping insulin practically non-existent. During intense exercise, the researchers forcibly infused glucose and insulin into the athletes' bloodstreams. The muscles actively rejected the incoming sugar. Because the fat pathways were open, the tissue continued to burn lipids. There is no arbitrary fat-burning zone based on heart rate. There is only a fat-burning physiological state, dictated by starting glycogen and sub-basal insulin levels. We see the practical consequence of this metabolic model when endurance athletes suddenly hit the wall. The traditional sports science explanation states that this failure occurs when the working leg muscles completely run out of stored glycogen. Clinical biopsies show this is false. When athletes reach the point of total physical collapse, significant, measurable glycogen still remains inside their muscle tissues. The true mechanism behind physical fatigue is neurological, governed by a pacing strategy known as the central governor theory. This graph plots physical performance over a prolonged exercise event. The decline is not random. It follows a precise logarithmic decay curve. This perfect curve isn't localized muscle failure. It's a neural pacing strategy executed by the brain, systematically throttling down motor unit recruitment. The brain is tracking millions of biological data points, but its primary motive for slowing the athlete down is to aggressively protect the critical 5-gram blood glucose pool. The brain executes this emergency override to protect the 5-gram circulatory pool from dropping below the threshold for central nervous system survival. Hitting the wall represents the brain executing an emergency override to protect the body's most sensitive hemodynamic constraint. In sports nutrition, the term metabolic flexibility often refers to an athlete's capacity to oxidize massive amounts of ingested sugar during competition. A more precise physiological definition of metabolic flexibility is the absence of hyperinsulinemia. Keeping insulin output below a critical threshold ensures that your mitochondria have uninhibited, continuous access to your endogenous fat stores, regardless of exercise intensity. By removing the forced metabolic disposal of dietary carbohydrates, humans unlock a continuous pathway for lipid oxidation that matches our evolutionary physiological design.